Welcome back, everybody. On your do now, I wanted you to wrap up all the stuff we learned yesterday about the U.S. versus Cuba. What was some of their interactions? How did the U.S. and Cuba get along or not? Hopefully, you brought up the fact that they were allies, they were on the same side, and then Cuba fell into a civil war, became communist. America really didn't like this, had a real problem with Cuba being communist, being so close to the United States. It was a threat as to the spread of communism, but also a strategic threat, like that they could launch nukes or invade the U.S. from Cuba. So this was a big deal. The U.S. tried to overthrow and start a new civil war. The Bay of Pigs. We had the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. How America tried to keep nukes out of Cuba, and how since then we've had an embargo on Cuba, where we don't do business or trade with them. Today we're going to be talking about the space race, which is U.S. versus the Soviet Union. It's going to be a science competition, essentially. It's not going to be about who can control the most allies, who can build the most nukes. It's not about strategic advantage in war, but it's also about proving who's the best. That's what the Cold War is about, is who's the best. So we got to be the best at everything, including science. And this is going to be essentially a race to the moon. Who can explore space the fastest? And it's a symbol of the Cold War, right? It's a symbol of this competition. Who's the better one? Who's the most technologically advanced? Um, but there's also, while that's going on, there's also this slight fear of like, what if the Soviet Union's put nukes in space? Which is something kind of we wouldn't think of today, but like back then, they could just put a satellite over the United States, which is just a few miles up in the air. It's not really that far. Again, you could drop nukes really fast without the other side being able to retaliate, which causes a lot of problems for the United States. So you definitely don't want your enemy to be more advanced technologically in any way. And that includes space exploration. So it's going to start um, late 50s, early 60s. The Soviets are going to launch the first satellite, the first man made object into space. It's called Sputnik. It's this ball shaped thing, and all it does is send a quick sort of radio signal back to Earth. So they're able to launch it high enough that it goes into orbit and communicate with it and with radio waves and stuff that they're able to go back and forth. Um, Obviously, when this happens, the U.S. freaks out. They're like, "Oh my God, they're in space!" Like that. Imagine a world where no one's been to space, and then you find out your mortal enemy knows how to do it. Right? It's really scary. Like, what if Sputnik was a nuke and they're going to drop it on the U.S.? Right? It's a very scary time. Um, Not long after that, the Soviet Union's going to start launching like dogs into space, and eventually, the first human being, his name is Yuri Gagarin. Um, is the first man in space. He's not in space for a ton of time. He's not up there for like days or anything. He's up there for hours before coming back, and he returns home safely. And the Soviets do a lot of the first things. The first two-person, I think the first female in space, were all Soviets. Um, it's during this time that JFK sort of sets a national goal and says, we are going to compete to be the most technologically advanced country, the most advanced with space exploration. He says to do that, we're going to be the first to get to the moon. And he says by the end of the 1960s, we're going to put a man on the moon. Right? And they sort of set this national goal, and America got behind it. They really rallied behind this idea of like we got to beat the Soviets, um, and we want to explore something new. It was this new exciting idea of like, could we do it? Could we achieve something great like this? So there's lots of different missions over the decade where eventually the U.S. gets a person in space and then orbits the Earth, and then we start sending missions towards the moon. And these are called the Apollo missions. And it's a collection of lots of different launches where we sent ships and people up to the moon, eventually getting up there with the Apollo 11 mission, which is going to be the first one to land on the moon. And they do this in July, I think, 1969. So they get in just before the end of the decade, which was Kennedy's goal. Um, a person lands on the moon. America's the first. Two men went on that first mission, brought back tons of rocks, put up flags, did all this stuff, and they returned home safely. Um, America went back 4 or 5 more times after that, maybe 6 more times. Into the 1970s, went several times, but then due to the cost and the lack of like sort of return. You didn't get anything out of this. We have stopped. We have not gone back to the moon since, although there is a lot of talk about trying to do that again in the next like 5 to 10 years. Here's a picture of Sputnik, the first satellite, the first thing ever man-made put into space. We'll watch a video about Sputnik. If you might pause this one. This is Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space, which again is really crazy, right? There didn't even have really planes that well developed that could fly and be trustworthy. And this guy's going to strap himself to a rocket, go to outer space. No one's really sure of if all this stuff works, if it can withstand space, what's it going to be like in space. And then how do you even get home? Which is really crazy that he was willing to do this. Here's a picture of the Apollo missions, the U.S. rockets that launched. Most of this is actually fuel. What they actually wrote in was just this like top little part right here. Here's some of the guys, the early missions, the first Americans in space. And then here's a picture from one of the later Apollo, not the first one. Astronaut landing on the moon, putting a flag, walking around, collecting rocks, doing experiments, stuff like that. Besides just the astronauts and stuff, there are a lot of scientists involved. I mean, this took thousands of people researching and doing experiments and doing math and doing all this stuff. Now, Neil Armstrong gets a lot of credit for being the first guy on the moon, but thousands of people helped him get there, including women and people of color, who often get overlooked when we tell about the history. Is like that they were very much involved in writing the code for the computers, or doing the equations to actually figure out the math, and like the complexity of the math to try and get a rocket and a person to the moon is insane. And a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds contributed to that. We got several videos we're going to watch as a class, so you can pause this video if you'd like, and we'll watch all these videos together. For your assignment today, you're going to read parts of JFK's speech, the speech that motivated America to create NASA and do all this space program with the goal of getting to the moon. After you read that speech, I want you to explain 2 reasons why going to the moon was a national goal in the 1960s.